B.1. Why are anarchists against authority and hierarchy? First, it is necessary to indicate what kind of authority anarchism challenges. While it is customary for some opponents of anarchism to assert that anarchists oppose all kinds of authority, the reality of the situation is more complex. While anarchists have, on occasion, stated their opposition to all authority, closer reading quickly shows that anarchists reject only one specific form of authority, what we tend to call hierarchy. See section H.4 for more details. This can be seen when Bakunin stated that, open quote, the principle of authority was the eminently theological, metaphysical, and political idea that the masses, always incapable of governing themselves, must submit at all times to the benevolent yoke of a wisdom and a justice, which in one way or another is imposed from above. End quote. Other forms of authority are more acceptable to anarchists. It depends whether the authority in question becomes a source of power over others or not. That is the key to understanding the anarchist position on authority. If it is hierarchical authority, then anarchists are against it. The reason is simple, open quote. No one should be entrusted with power, inasmuch as anyone invested with authority must become an oppressor and exploiter of society, end quote. This distinction between forms of authority is important. As Erich Fromm pointed out, open quote, authority is a broad term with two entirely different meanings. It can be either rational or irrational authority. Rational authority is based on competence, and it helps the person who leans on it to grow. Irrational authority is based on power and serves to exploit the person subjected to it. End quote. The same point was made by Bakunin over 100 years earlier, when he indicated the difference between authority and natural influence. For Bakunin, individual freedom, open quote, results from the great number of material, intellectual, and moral influences which every individual around him or her and which society continually exercise. To abolish this mutual influence would be to die. Consequently, when we reclaim the freedom of the masses, we hardly wish to abolish the effect of any individual's or any group of individuals' natural influence upon the masses. What we wish is to abolish artificial, privileged, legal, and official influences. End quote. It is, in other words, the difference between taking part in a decision and listening to alternative viewpoints and experts' natural influence before making your mind up, and having a decision made for you by a separate group of individuals who may or may not be elected because that is their role in an organization or society. In the former, the individual exercises their judgment and freedom, i.e., is based on rational authority. In the latter, they are subjected to the wills of others, to hierarchical authority, i.e., is based on irrational authority. This is because rational authority, open quote, not only permits but requires constant scrutiny and criticism. It is always temporary, its acceptance depending on its performance. The source of irrational authority, on the other hand, is always power over people. Power on the one side, fear on the other, are always the buttresses on which irrational authority is built. Thus, the former is based upon equality, while the latter is by its very nature based upon inequality. End quote. This crucial point is expressed in the difference between having authority and being an authority. Being an authority just means that a given person is generally recognized as competent for a given task, based on his or her individual skills and knowledge. Put differently, it is socially acknowledged expertise. In contrast, having authority is a social relationship based on status and power derived from a hierarchical position, not an individual ability. Obviously, this does not mean that competence is not an element for obtaining a hierarchical position. It just means that the real or alleged initial competence is transferred to the title or position of the authority and so becomes independent of individuals, i.e., institutionalized, or what Bakunin termed official. The difference is important because the way people behave is more a product of the institutions in which we are raised than of an inherent nature. In other words, social relationships shape the individuals involved. This means that the various groups individuals create have traits, behaviors, and outcomes that cannot be understood by reducing them to the individuals within them. That is, groups consist not only of individuals, but also relationships between individuals, and these relationships will affect those subject to them. For example, obviously, open quote, the exercise of power by some disempowers others, and so through a combination of physical intimidation, economic domination and dependency, and psychological limitations, social institutions and practices affect the way everyone sees the world and her or his place in it. This, as we discuss in the next section, impacts on those involved in such authoritarian social relationships as, open quote, the exercise of power in any institutionalized form, whether economic, political, or sexual, brutalizes both the wielder of power and the one over whom it is exercised. End quote. Authoritarian social relationships means dividing society into the few, order givers, and the many, order takers, impoverishing the individuals involved mentally, emotionally, and physically, and society as a whole. Human relationships in all parts of life are stamped by authority, not liberty. And as freedom can only be created by freedom, authoritarian social relationships and the obedience they require do not and cannot educate a person in freedom. Only participation, self-management in all areas of life can do that. Open quote. In a society based on exploitation and servitude, in Kropotkin's words, human nature itself is degraded, and it is only as servitude disappears that we shall regain our rights. End quote. Of course, it will be pointed out that in any collective undertaking, there is a need for cooperation and coordination, and this need to subordinate the individual to group activities is a form of authority. Therefore, it is claimed, a democratically managed group is just as authoritarian as one based on hierarchical authority. Anarchists are not impressed by such arguments. Yes, we reply, of course, in any group undertaking, there is a need to make and stick by agreements, but anarchists argue that to use the word authority to describe two fundamentally different ways of making decisions is playing with words. It obscures the fundamental difference between free association and hierarchical imposition, and confuses cooperation with command. As we note in section H.4, Marxists are particularly fond of this fallacy. Simply put, there are two different ways of coordinating individual activity within groups, either by authoritarian means or by libertarian means. Proudhon, in relation to workplaces, makes the difference clear. Open quote. Either the workman will be simply the employee of the proprietor capitalist promoter, or he will participate and have a voice in the council. In a word, he will become an associate. In the first case, the workman is subordinated, exploited. His permanent condition is one of obedience. In the second case, he resumes his dignity as a man and citizen. He forms part of the producing organization, of which he was before but the slave. As in the town, he forms part of the sovereign power, of which he was before but the subject. We need not hesitate, for we have no choice. It is necessary to form an association among workers, because without that, they would remain related as subordinates and superiors, and there would ensue two castes of masters and wage workers, which is repugnant to a free and democratic society. End quote. In other words, associations can be based upon a form of rational authority, based upon natural influence, and so reflect freedom, the ability of individuals to think, act, and feel, and manage their own time and activity. Otherwise, we include elements of slavery into our relationships with others, elements that poison the whole and shape us in negative ways. See section B.1.1. Only the reorganization of society in a libertarian way, and we may add, the mental transformation such a change requires and would create, will allow the individual to, open quote, achieve more or less complete blossoming whilst continuing to develop, and banish that spirit of submission that has been artificially thrust upon him or her, end quote. So anarchists, open quote, ask nothing better than to see others exercise over us a natural and legitimate influence, freely accepted and never imposed. We accept all natural authorities and all influences of fact, but none of right. End quote. Anarchist support for free association within directly democratic groups is based upon such organizational forms increasing influence and reducing irrational authority in our lives. Members of such organizations can create and present their own ideas and suggestions, critically evaluate the proposals and suggestions from their fellows, accept those that they agree with or become convinced by, and have the option of leaving the association if they are unhappy with its direction. Hence, the influence of individuals and their free interaction determine the nature of the decisions reached, and no one has the right to impose their ideas on another. As Bakunin argued, in such organizations, open quote, no function remains fixed, and it will not remain permanently and irrevocably attached to one person. Hierarchical order and promotion do not exist. In such a system, power, properly speaking, no longer exists. Power is diffused to the collectivity and becomes the true expression of the liberty of everyone. End quote. Therefore, anarchists are opposed to irrational, for example, illegitimate authority, in other words, hierarchy. Hierarchy being the institutionalization of authority within a society. Hierarchical social institutions include the state, see section B.2, private property and the class systems it produces, see section B.3, and therefore capitalism, see section B.4. Due to their hierarchical nature, anarchists oppose these with passion. Open quote. Every institution, social or civil, argued Voltaire de Cleyre, that stands between man or woman and his or her right, every tie that renders one a master, another a serf, every law, every statute, every be it enacted that represents tyranny, anarchists seek to destroy. End quote. However, hierarchy exists beyond these institutions. For example, hierarchical social relationships include sexism, racism, and homophobia, see section B.1.4, and anarchists oppose and fight them all. Thus, as well as fighting capitalism as being hierarchical, for workers slave in a factory, albeit the slavery ends with the working hours, de Cleyre also opposed patriarchal social relationships which produce a, open quote, home that rests on slavery because of a marriage that represents the sale and transfer of the individuality of one of its parties to the other, end quote. Needless to say, while we discuss different forms of hierarchy in different sections, this does not imply that anarchists think they and their negative effects are somehow independent or can be easily compartmentalized. For example, the modern state and capitalism are intimately interrelated and cannot be considered as independent of each other. Similarly, social hierarchies like sexism and racism are used by other hierarchies to maintain themselves. For example, bosses will use racism to divide and so rule their workers. From this, it follows that abolishing one or some of these hierarchies, while desirable, would not be sufficient. Abolishing capitalism while maintaining the state would not lead to a free society, and vice versa, if it were possible. As Murray Bookchin notes, open quote, there can be a decidedly classless, even a non-exploitative society in the economic sense that still preserve hierarchical rule and domination in the social sense, whether they take the form of the patriarchal family, domination by age and ethnic groups, bureaucratic institutions, ideological manipulation, or a pyramidal division of labor. Classless or not, society would be riddled by domination and, with domination, a general condition of command and obedience, of unfreedom and humiliation, and perhaps most decisively, an abortion of each individual's potentiality for consciousness, reason, selfhood, creativity, and the right to assert full control over her or his daily life. End quote. This clearly implies that anarchists, open quote, challenge not only class formations but hierarchies, not only material exploitation but domination in every form. End quote. Hence, the anarchists stress on opposing hierarchy rather than just, say, the state, as some falsely assert, or simply economic class and exploitation, as, say, many Marxists do. As noted earlier in section 8.2.8, Anarchists consider all hierarchies to be not only harmful but unnecessary, and think that there are alternatives, more egalitarian ways to organize social life. In fact, we argue that hierarchical authority creates the conditions it is presumably designed to combat, and thus tends to be self-perpetuating. Thus, hierarchical organizations erode the ability of those at the bottom to manage their own affairs directly, so requiring hierarchy and some people in positions to give orders and the rest to follow them. Rather than prevent disorder, governments are among its primary causes, while its bureaucracies, ostensibly set up to fight poverty, wind up perpetuating it, because without poverty, the high-salaried top administrators would be out of work. The same applies to agencies intended to eliminate drug abuse, fight crime, etc. In other words, the power and privileges deriving from top hierarchical positions constitute a strong incentive for those who hold them not to solve the problems they are supposed to solve. For further discussion, see Marilyn French, Beyond Power, on Women, Men, and Morals.